start recording. Hello to anybody who's coming in. Just quickly, I'll say I did just answer a question about the quizzes. You won't have a quiz necessarily every week, but when you do have a quiz, you do have 2 attempts. I do take the highest score. That should happen automatically. Every once in a while, there's a mistake with my settings, right? And so if you notice you took the quiz twice and say you got 8 points on one try and 9 or 10 on the next try, but you didn't get your highest score, just send me a message. It's a click of a button. It's very easy for me to fix. And the other question that I just fielded was about the discussions, right? How are people going to know if they're on track, if they're making the right points, if they are engaging with the material in the correct way? And that is going to be something that we flesh out together here in our Zoom session. So definitely answer the discussions to the best of your ability, but always know that we're going to be working through some of those things, and that's one of the reasons why we're having these Zoom sessions. Other questions before we jump in? Okay, I will just remind you all that we have our fall 2020 meet and greet, Black Studies and Chicano Studies happening tonight. I sent an announcement last week about that. And that will be from 6 to 7. There's an announcement, there's a flyer, there's a link. I'll probably, if I have time, send an announcement this evening as a reminder. And that's just an opportunity for those of you who are interested in learning more about our departments, the way we work together, or just trying to figure out how to form some type of community and get connected with resources on campus. We always try and do that on campus when we are not off campus, but we figured we would try it virtually this time. And so you're all welcome to come. I am offering extra credit for those of you who come and do a short write-up, and the write-up will be easy and it will be based on what it is that we do in the meet and greet. And so I'll have more information about that to come. So I hope to see some of you there. And I already saw a few of you have signed up. And so with that, let me just take you one place. I want to just make an announcement that our next Zoom session is going to be on Thursday. I really wish that I could easily just flip back and forth, but I'm already seeing that that's going to be very confusing for people, even if I post it and remind you, because you guys are taking lots of classes, and I understand that. So I am going to really push to try and make all of our sessions on Thursday, and that way we can have some consistency. I told you by week 3, I would try and have a schedule, or at least a pattern. That's the pattern that I'm going to go for. That will at least allow me to get your modules up. You guys can get into them. And then I won't be trying to teach a class after having just released a module that I spent 5 hours creating, if that makes sense. It will also mean that you all don't have to try and juggle Tuesday versus Thursday every time. I'm still going to keep posting the schedule in our Canvas, and I'll just show you very quickly where you can find that. And for those of you who already got this down, I appreciate your patience. There are definitely a few people who are confused by the schedule. Getting a lot of people who are in my Zoom room all day long, every day. I get these emails of you guys entering my Zoom room. So I just want you to know that if you're ever unclear where it is you need to go, right? And so this is our course. I'll go ahead and put it in student view so it doesn't show you anything that you don't usually see. And right there on the front page, I've added our Zoom meetings, right? This is letting you know the format, but there is a hyperlink that'll take you right to the module and to our modules and schedules. And that's where you can find out where our next meeting is. And you'll see that I've already updated the schedule that our next meeting will be Thursday. I'm still kind of reserving that right to, on occasion, use a Tuesday, and I only really anticipate that to come around review time, maybe around exam time. That might throw our schedule off a little bit, but otherwise I will work to just create lessons that work with the Thursday schedule. And so that will be our schedule moving forward. I will always give you enough time if there is ever a change in that. If I ever need to have you on Tuesday, I won't throw it up at you at the last minute. So you won't ever have to worry about that. And
quick question.
yes.
So since our classes are on Thursday instead of Tuesday, does that change the date of when our discussions are due, or they still due Monday?
They're still due Monday. And I still want you to think about class on Tuesday and Thursday, right? Because I will be delivering your Canvas modules by Tuesday by 8 a.m., right? So the point of it is you should be thinking about Tuesday as a work on your own day. Some of you may choose to like extend that, right? But the way I'll be designing the modules is about an hour and a half, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little less. So do plan on Tuesdays, keep those Tuesdays, because that way you'll know that, okay, it's Tuesday, 8 a.m. What are we doing today? And then you can get through that lesson and it doesn't drag on. And I actually can recommend you working on things right away and not waiting until the last minute. I give you the full week because I know everybody has schedule conflicts, right? But this is kind of designed, the things are designed for you to complete within that time period typically. So, so keep that in mind. Other questions? All right. And it's okay to keep asking questions. It's okay to email me or to send me a message in Canvas if you're confused. I just want to make sure that we don't have people who are waking up and getting ready and getting their cameras on and finding me not here, because I know that's been happening for a couple of you. So know where to look and keep Thursday as the in-session time, right? And again, this is a hybrid course, and I maybe didn't make that entirely clear because it isn't totally clear in our system, but we are technically, by our schedule, half of our, about 60% of our class is fully through Canvas. These check-ins are the other piece. I know that it was confusing in the schedule because our system didn't know how to handle this new format that we made up in order to make this time, right? Or meet the needs of this time. All right, so that's 15 minutes in. That's usually what happens in class, takes a little bit longer in Zoom. So let's go ahead and jump into some of this course material. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so that we can talk about some of these pieces. What's happening? All right, we're going to come back to the dynamics of domination, but I do just want to quickly just make sure that we are clear on what we're doing this unit. And I want to make this clear, especially even thinking about some of the discussions, right? One clear thing is always, always, always make sure that you're reading what it is that I put in the modules, read my directions, right? And also go through the module and make sure that you've actually read or viewed the material that I'm asking you questions on before you actually attempt answering the questions, right? And in this particular module for this unit, we're talking about ancient Africa. As I mentioned, a very quick and easy look at it. We're not going in depth. For those of you who are interested in the history, African history in general, whether it be ancient, or colonial, or contemporary, I will encourage you to think about taking the African history course through City College's Black Studies Department. It's taught by our very own Anthony Merritt, Dr. Merritt, who also teaches for Mesa College. Because what we're doing here is really just setting the stage, right? Really understanding that we can't begin to study people of African descent if we don't start with Africa and Africans themselves, right? Oftentimes we tend to start with thinking about Africans after European contact, after the period of enslavement already began, after colonization of the continent actually occurred, right? And that really skews our understanding of who it is we're talking about, and that also tells us a little bit about what perspective we're privileging, right? When we privilege the perspective of Europeans, right? And so that's why we want to take it all the way back. Before we study African Americans, we have to think about the continent. We have to think about the ways in which Africans lived and existed, especially those who will be in the part of the continent that will be the most exploited when we think about what becomes known as the transatlantic slave trade. And so that's why we're beginning here. But we only really look at a few things, right? And so the module that I gave you all to work through just took you through a few pieces, right? Thinking about Africa as the birthplace of humanity, right? Thinking about the origins of humanity, thinking about the ways in which the earliest human remains continue to be found in the continent of Africa, and specifically in East Africa. And you saw a little bit of footage about that. And with each new discovery, the roots go deeper and deeper and deeper into the continent of Africa. There was then a little bit around ancient Egypt and thinking about the ancient Egyptians, which many people are familiar with. And a lot of folks are familiar with ancient Egypt because there has been very little question about the role of ancient Egypt in terms of modern, in terms of the evolution of civilization and thinking about our earliest civilizations. Ancient Egypt has been given credit for that. But what we got to explore was the ways in which Egypt has, and specifically during the time period when enslavement was being cemented, right? When Africans were being enslaved in mass, and that was becoming really the roots of what will become our ideas of race and racism, at least in terms of thinking about the Western Hemisphere, is the ways in which Egypt gets removed from Africa. Right? The ways in which people start to think about Egypt as completely separate. And that has everything to do with the fact that you can't understand early civilizations if you're also positioning Africa as having no value, as having no history, right? As having no relevance to humanity, right? And many of you have explored, and we'll talk about it in just a little bit, the ways that your education may have taught you different, which is great. And we're seeing lots and lots of strides. In fact, even in this class in particular, I'm teaching 3 sections of this class. I've got 2 fully online sections, and I've got this hybrid thing that we have. And I've got educators through and through my class, people who are looking to go into K through 12 education, people who are already teaching, who are looking to now learn what they didn't learn when they were themselves becoming educators, right? And so there's a lot of ways that we start to see people's understanding of Africa, and specifically ancient Africa, broadening. It's not unheard of these days for people to know that the earliest human remains have been found and continue to be found deep within East Africa. It's not unheard of for people to know that Egypt is a part of Africa, right? But for a very, very long time, that was not the narrative. The dominant narrative was that Africa had nothing of value, that Africa had no history, that the people had no culture worthy of study. And that trickles down into the ways in which African Americans, and those will be those within the United States and throughout the Americas more broadly, will see and understand and think about themselves in the ways in which they are left out of the narrative of history, and especially thinking about what peace, right? What does it mean if you know nothing about your African roots, if you identify as an African American person, right? And so those are the reasons why we begin here. The Nile Valley civilization piece was to also broaden us, right? For us to think about not just Egypt, right? Or Kemet, as the ancient Africans in this area called themselves, or called this region. But thinking about the larger region, and the fact that there were more than just the Egyptians. We have the Nubians that we know were also in this area, who had an intimate relationship. Oftentimes, there was a change in rulership, or over time, I should say, there was a change in rulership, and so it wasn't always harmonious, but there was very clear political and economic connections between the Nile Valley civilizations that were along the Nile Valley. And so that's where I wanted you all to start. And then, of course, I took you through some of the West African empires, which we'll talk about. But before we get into all that, I'll just, oops, what's happening here? I'll show you these pieces that you had in your module, again, just to really remind us what we're talking about. We're talking about a continent, and I stress that so much because the ways in which Africa as a continent has been minimized over time, and continues to be, is really reflective of how we tend to talk about it, right? We tend to talk about it as singular. We tend to talk about it as not being diverse. We tend to talk about it as being kind of one culture, right? Only one culture comes out of this space. And that has everything to do with the fact that we're ignorant, usually, that we don't know, that we haven't been taught. And we tend to come from a Eurocentric and also a US-centric perspective. Those of us who have been born and raised and educated in the United States have a tendency to think very US-centric, right? So I like to disrupt that a little bit in thinking about how large of a place we're talking about, and also the diversity, right? And even down to the climate, right? And your textbook gets into this. This is actually a picture from your textbook, and to remind us that we are not talking about a singular place. We don't talk about Europe as if it's a singular place, and I want you to think about the ways in which that is often not extended to Africa, and even question yourself, right? And there are some of you even in your discussion boards, and I may have challenged you in your discussion, or there's a couple points that I will challenge on, right? I don't always make a ton of comments, but things like if you were referring to Africa as a country, I would have corrected you and said, think about that. Think about where that comes from, or why that is. And that even in and of itself helps us think about how domination works, right? How the dynamics of domination work, that so many people can so easily think of Africa as minimal, as marginal, right? Because it has been for so long marginalized, right? All right. And then, of course, you got to see the piece about the birthplace of humanity. We always like to stress that, right? And I stress that in not just my course that thinks about this time period, right? But in all of my Black Studies classes, right? When we think about the significance of studying Africa, it's not just significant to the study of African Americans, right? It's significant to the study of all people. And so hopefully, if you haven't gotten into the clips that are in this module, you'll get a chance to look at that when you do, to see some of the evidence, hear from some of the archaeologists and historians who have done this work. And then, of course, this last piece where we left off with our discussion in thinking about the dynamics of domination and the impact, right? And so Dr. Hilliard set us up in thinking about how domination works, and his whole point of that presentation was to say we must start with Africa, and we must start with African sources. And I like that that clip because it demonstrates some of the work that scholars had been doing for 20, 30 years up until that point, right? Dr. Hilliard is one of the early scholars in Black studies, and really pushing people to think about the way history had been written for so long, especially the history of Africa and people of African descent, and the ways in which we need to challenge that with primary sources, and need to challenge that by going back to the source, right? And so that was the purpose of his presentation, but also to think about the way domination happens, right? And this is something that we're going to come back to throughout this course, right? The ways in which through domination, there's an impact, right? And so how is it that we have people who have no memory of an African past, right? That happened through a process of domination, right? Thinking about enslavement, thinking about colonialism, thinking about even the construction of race itself, right? In this module that we're looking at, you got to see the ways in which Africans and Europeans and those throughout the Middle East were working and trading together as partners, right? Before we see the massive development of the Atlantic slave trade, which is going to develop specifically with the discovery of a whole bunch of new land, at least the discovery by Europeans, specifically the Portuguese and the Spanish, right? And so once there is an incentive, an economic incentive, the game changes, right? And so the processes changes. And so we start to see enslavement, we start to see the process of teaching white supremacy, right? Teaching this idea that people of African descent were different from people of European descent, and that it becomes a justification for enslavement. Religion becomes a part of how white supremacy also becomes taught. The ways in which people worshiped was judged and became a justification for enslavement. And then that's how we get the controlling of institutions of socialization, right? And the controlling of wealth, and then eventually physical segregation, right? So Hilliard is basically talking us through the way domination happens, the ways in which people get subjugated. And he's speaking specifically about the ways in which not understanding, not knowing one's history, one's past, this idea of the loss of memory is a big piece of that, right? If you don't know who you are, you can't challenge someone telling you you're not a human being, right? Does that make sense a little bit? All right, I'm gonna stop my share for a minute just so I can take a look at faces, make sure I don't have any questions in the chat. I wanna pause here and just ask you all, any questions or comments about that? And again, this is all coming from the module about the dynamics of domination. Okay. So now in thinking about your responses, and this I do want a little feedback, I'm gonna ask you to either type something in the chat, you can type it to everyone, you can type it to me privately, right? You have those two options, or you can unmute yourself and you can speak to the class. This is a participation moment, all right? We're gonna see how it works. I do plan on using the breakout rooms at some point, just not today. We're gonna see how it works in the larger group format. So knowing that at least 35 of you submitted your discussion boards, so you thought about these questions, thinking about what was your perception of Africa before this lesson? What were your thoughts?
From my point of view, it was, what I had been taught in school and what I had heard through the press and the media. And I think, from my idea was that of, one of where there's a lot of wild animals and, a beautiful country, but at the same time, one where there was a lot of sickness and starvation, very poor people. I had the impression of South Africa versus Black Africa, so white Africa versus Black Africa. But I didn't really have a great impression of it until, or my own impression of it until I went, to Africa, and I was, had a trip there, and then
what part did you go to specifically?
We went to South Africa, and also to we went to, we took a safari,
Okay.
and so, wasn't seeing all of Africa, but it was, but it certainly gave me a better appreciation of Africa, both good and bad. but at least it gave me a filter through which I could then appreciate what I hear about Africa now.
So, and those are all really great points, thinking about kind of a minimal understanding that you said you had kind of previously, Janet, and then that got expanded when you were able to travel there. And it sounds like even over time, there was just some expansion in your understanding than maybe from some earlier teachings. But kind of the specifics of really just thinking about the wildlife, right? Thinking about the safari, what is shown in safari. That's one specific vision of Africa that gets seen through tourism usually, right? And doesn't usually, there's other aspects that don't always get seen.
And National Geographic, I think, someone had mentioned in one of the things, National Geographic played an important part, at least in my life as well.
Oh yeah, me too. National Geographic was probably where I saw the most images growing up. If we're thinking about just where people were getting their ideas. And that's why people go directly to wildlife, right? As opposed to like people. You know what I mean? Like literally, the only thing people ever talk about as beautiful or a value usually, or at least the first thing, I shouldn't say the only, that was a generalization, is the wildlife, right? We think about animals before we think about people. Right? Think about that.
Yeah,
right?
and they skinned all those animals too. So.
It's not a judgment. It's something to think about, right? It's how domination works, right? Doris, I see a hand, and I saw a hand, Amy. So we'll go Doris and then Amy.
I was wanting to say something, but I didn't actually raise my hand. I will
Oh,
say,
I see your hand raised.
my husband, he was military, and he had gone through Africa about 3 times touring, with the boat. But what he did do, he brought back a lot of woodwork. And what I found was that average people there were highly skilled in woodwork. He brought ivory, different types of wood that I don't know the name of, but I had never seen anything like it before, just highly skilled.
Mm-hmm. So recognizing the skill set that comes out, and a lot of people will appreciate what comes out of Africa in terms of the woodwork, the goods, but never actually appreciate the skill, like who's actually making these pieces that people bring back and adorn their homes with. But lots of skill, and we'll think about that a little bit today when we talk about culture, and we talk about even thinking about some of the retentions that Africans who will be forced from the continent will be bringing with them to the Americas. Because oftentimes when we even think about enslavement, we forget about the skills that it actually takes to be working in agriculture, to be working in brick making, in building things, which is what enslaved people were forced to do. They built this country. And so we'll think about that. Amy, I see a hand, but right before I go to you, I just want to acknowledge, I see people are following my directions. A few of you are in the chat. A few of you are typing to me privately. I want to encourage that. So I am looking for you to participate right now, right? Either verbally with our group or via the chat. And if you're not quite ready to participate fully with the chat, we can use this time. You can send me a private message. You have the option to do that in the chat. And I do see a couple questions. I'm going to come to them. I'm going to just go to Amy first. So go ahead, Amy.
Two things. The first one is I actually saw on a video. It was like their Instagram, but it was pretty accurate. Our maps are so US centric that if we were to enlarge the continents as the sizes they would be, Africa would be about 3 to 5 times larger than what we actually see on a map, which is, I can see that how it relates to, I guess, teaching white supremacy. Yeah. And then going off of Janet, what she said with the depictions of Africa through media, a lot of those advertisements and commercials really are just money grubbing. Like we don't, I think it's just like 10% of every dollar that goes to these funds actually get donated. So usually just like if you just educate yourself and just like avoid the money grubbing. It'd be a
Yeah,
better
there's a
way
lot
to
of
help out.
and we don't see it as much as say maybe in like the late 80s and the early 90s. There was a lot of that happening. Were different organizations that were tied um, uh, to Africa did a lot of advertising in the United States through television, but the type of advertising for help, and it's not to say that poverty doesn't exist, that there isn't a lot of need right throughout the entire continent, because that is real, but the ways in which certain images get poured onto us with and only one type of image really does skew our understanding, and it also skews our understanding of why Africa and certain countries throughout the continent are in the positions that they are in, right? We never think about what colonialism did to Africa, right? Even Janet mentioned South Africa. How did white people get to South Africa? How did that happen, right? Thinking about the apartheid system as a whole, what was that? It was a whole system of racial separation that existed. And that was very similar to the system of segregation in the American South. And those are pieces also that we don't think about. If you only kind of marginalize Africa as a subject, as a receiver, as something to be subjugated, you miss also those other pieces. And so part of the dynamics of domination, how it works, is also taking out of the equation when we're thinking about how do we get where we are, who's doing the dominating, and what does that look like, right? And so we spend a lot of time thinking about that in this class as well. Right, I will push you all to think about the period of enslavement that we're moving into, and to think deeply about what people who were doing the enslaving were doing. Right, not just think about those who were enslaved, and that again is about thinking about perspective, and about thinking about how it is that we are challenging the ways in which domination worked against African people and those who would eventually define themselves as African Americans, but also in terms of our own learning process as well. And so those are some of your guys' thoughts. I see in the chat there was ideas around the size and beauty and the landscape and the coastlines of Africa in terms of what comes to mind, but not necessarily the culture and the history. Are people having freezing issues with the, yes? No? I don't know, that might be an internet issue on your side. I'm actually pretty solid here. I just saw that in the chat. Mackenzie, is that Mackenzie?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so sorry, my voice, I don't know what's going on. But I had a lot of similar views to Janet. I was always taught that Africa was super poor, and the only thing, when I heard anything positive about Africa, it was always towards South Africa. Like, South Africa was the nice part of Africa. Everything else was with poverty, and they had no food or water, and they didn't really have any housing. So yeah, I mean, my views grew as I got older and didn't just rely on my class to teach me about Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But another thing is that personally, I feel with history and learning about Africans in general, we always start with slavery. I never really hear before that. Like, if anything, it's like it starts with, oh, we took them on boats and we brought them here. I never really hear about before that, before they were slaves. So I want to learn more about that, just because I feel like every time I hear about history and Africans, which is a huge part of their history, being slaves, I don't hear anything more than that.
Yeah. And think about the impact of that, right? How that is part of the dynamics of domination, right? If we only talk about Africans as being enslaved, like you have no history prior to enslavement. That's the message that is sending. And think about how that impacts people, right? Especially young children growing up, right? When you think about when you first were introduced to some of these concepts, and if you're only thought about, well, we were slaves, then there's some of that internalized piece that comes in, right? Where you start thinking, well, then I don't want to learn anything about who I am, because I don't feel good about this connection to my history stops with enslavement. My history
Well,
stops with
when I
Dominique.
was younger, I'm half black and half Mexican, and I just remember like it's naive to say now, but this is really how I thought. Like when I was hearing about history, I was almost embarrassed to be African because everything was about poverty and slaves, and it just made me feel bad.
Yeah, yeah. Um, has anybody noticed that my last name is African? Anybody? Yes. So anybody know where my father might be from? Anybody in my class before? So my name is Ugandan. My father's from Uganda. My mother's from Nebraska. Growing up, I used to be like, I am truly African American, right? That's my mother is a Black American, African American from Nebraska. But I remember specifically to your point, Mackenzie, the moment in school when I realized that people had negative ideas of Africa, and it was around second or third grade. And it was because I brought my father in for like show and tell. And it was part of the what we were doing. It was people were bringing in family members, and he was talking about, or I had to bring a cassette. We use cassettes. So I did an interview with him. I didn't bring him in. I brought him in via audio. And he had an accent, a very heavy accent. And it was the first time that I understood that people treated people with accents differently. It was the first time that people were kind of snickering about my background. I didn't fully understand it until maybe like fifth or sixth grade, but it was the first time, and it was so different from my understanding, right? I was someone who, growing up, I heard stories, I understood, I learned a little bit about the culture, I learned, what are they called, different folk tales or folklore. Unfortunately, I did not retain or learn any language, but thinking about how very early on, the minute where something I was super proud of that I introduced to peers in a classroom educational setting, it was not welcome. And this was in the 1980s, right? And this was during a time where the very kind of dominant image of anything African was negative, right? Especially in the media, and especially if we're thinking about what children had access to. All right, I see two hands. I'll go Alex and then Samuel. So Alex.
Yes, I was just trying to add a little bit to the size of Africa. I understand that you put the all China, US, and this, but and correct me if I'm wrong. So Africa is close to, it's like around the equator. So now if you get the sphere, the globe, if you go on top on the North Pole, you can walk like for like 1 minute at the beginning. And then as you go down, you have Russia and you see this massive land. However, if you put that in perspective, and if you go further down towards the equator, that amount, the whole Russia can fit, I think, the Northern Africa, the Sahara, and the Northern Savannah, the whole Russia that looks enormous. Only Savannah and Sahara is as big as that.
So I'm not sure what you're asking me, because I am definitely not a geographer. So I can't get into those specifics. But what can you either say it and put it in the form of a question, or maybe make a statement that you're trying to share with the class? One or the other.
I was trying to make a statement to share with the class that the enormous size of Africa, if like picture like Russia, as we, at least I imagine the biggest country in the world, like only Sahara and Savannah, North Savannah, is as big as Russia.
Okay, so thank you.
so if I can say so, because of the globe, the nature of the globe.
I understand your point, but how does that take away from the fact that Africa in and of itself is large?
No, it's just adds to it. Like if you want a picture, Africa, how big it is, if you want to get a better picture of that,
put it inside of Russia instead of the US.
I mean, because US has 3 time zones and Russia has nine time zones. Like
I see what you're saying. I think that again, this you're demonstrating the ways in which it's helpful to even take outside of a US centric kind of focus, right? And so bringing in the example, and like I'm not a geographer, and so I can't kind of give you all of the different specifications of different like land masses. But the whole point is that we tend to think of Africa as much smaller than it is, not just in terms of space, though that is a big piece of it, but also in terms of culture and diversity, right? We don't tend to think of it as diverse. We don't tend to think of it as having different regions, as having different climate zones, as having different groups of people who identify in different ways, right? And so it's helpful to, it's helpful to think about it in relationship to other large land masses as we start to disrupt our notions of what's big and what's not big, right? Samuel.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of piggyback off what Janet said, and like I think it's interesting to see the different point of views and learning eras, because she experienced something completely different compared to a lot of us younger students, and I just think it's cool to see the contrast, because compared to me, I was taught that, you know, of course, like Egypt and like this safari and South Africa were like the only parts that school ever covered. But like I was fortunate enough to like learn that like outside of those three things that America thinks are the only parts of Africa, like Africa was really a beautiful place. And yeah, that was it.
And another piece that also comes up a lot in terms of even just the progress over time is just the differences in education systems, sometimes depending on where someone went to school, right? Where they're
Right.
from within the United States or even broadly. Oftentimes people who are educated outside of the United States have a much more thorough understanding of Africa and Africa's history, culture, and depth. And then depending on what part of the United States, there's been movements to really kind of deepen the curriculum. And we see that especially in places like Philadelphia. Pennsylvania has done a lot with their curriculum broadly.
Oh,
Rhode
to
Island is
piggyback.
another state that's done a lot with their curriculum broadly, where they're really mandating certain things. We're starting even to see LA and Unified just mandated in ethnic studies. And so we'll start to see a broader understanding of not just our country, but our world in terms of how we're teaching people and from all ages. Samuel, I still see a hand. Is that an old
Oh,
hand or is that a new?
sorry. Yeah.
No, it's okay.
What's it called? I just wanted to let you know that I think Virginia actually just passed a law saying that what's it called? Students are allowed to choose between Black studies or U.S. history.
Okay, so there's a lot of movement happening, and we're going to see even more movement around that happening. I'll add in terms of perspective that it's not just education, right? We've already mentioned media, television, ads, things like that. I also asked you all about what you all see in terms of your social media or thinking about popular culture, and just so we address that piece of the question. And this is for anybody who wants to share what are some of the images that you see now, right, in terms of the depictions of Africa, whether it be in popular culture, social media, or even just your general, going through life. What ideas or depictions do you see, or are you aware of? Or maybe you don't see any. It depends.
I have a small comment on that,
Yes.
Doris. What I've noticed personally, probably over the past 20 years for me, living in LA at one point, I used to go get my hair braided at African beauty salons. So I had the opportunity to engage with the women and learn a little bit about geographical locations, just a little bit. But I noticed in just being around them, the similarities between myself and them, when at one time I thought that Africans were, I don't know, less educated than American Black people. I found actually that they seem to be more educated than American Black people. You know, I don't know just that. I'm not really good at talking. I think I write
No,
better.
I think you've made a great point, and I think that you've touched on also how the dynamics of domination have worked to kind of divide and create tensions and separations between people of African descent, what we call the diaspora broadly, right? The African diaspora, people who've been scattered, right, dispersed throughout the world, largely through enslavement. And so we are part of the diaspora, but we are connected to our African brothers and sisters, but don't always feel that connection because of the way the divides and the domination has worked. But you're noticing similarities. And one of the things that we'll talk about in this class, at least specific to the periods of times that we'll study, are the way Africans, at least those who were brought during the period of enslavement, will retain pieces of culture, and that will become part of what becomes African American culture in terms of the connections to family, some of the connections to spirituality, even traditions around food and clothing, dress and dance and music, will be pieces that are not just coming out of nowhere. Black people were not blank slates because of enslavement. The African culture and cultures and retentions are there. And then, of course, the piece that you mentioned about the assumption that that Black Americans were more educated. There's a lot of assumptions, especially for any of us who were around during the times where there were the most demeaning and marginalizing images of Africans really prevalent and happening at around the same time as a lot of immigration from the continent was coming in. I think about myself growing up in the 80s and 90s and thinking about what that meant. When there was a lot of immigration and the ways in which our society dealt with that and marginalized people coming in that made people like me not necessarily identify with people who look just like me, right? And so that's something that we can think about in this class even more. But the piece about the skill sets that Africans are coming with, the culture, we can think about that contemporary or even the past, and we don't want to erase it, so to speak. Any other additions or hands? I was going to add that, and I know most of us are aware of the passing of Chadwick Boseman. I will share that I've been teaching at Mesa College since 2015. And I remember specifically the ways in which people's understanding, or at least identification with African culture, whether it be fictitious or not, changed after Black Panther was made. And specifically, like the idea of a glorious past, the idea of a rich and continent full of tradition and culture was something that I didn't have to explain as much. And it was the difference literally of a semester that I saw that happening. And so representation matters in terms of what we think, and that's how domination works as well. And if we think about the images that existed pre Black Panther, and I usually say people's ideas have changed. And so that's something else that we can think about. And then, of course, depending on who you are and who your friends are and who your social feeds are and who your networks are, the social network question that I had as part of the discussion could go in either way. Some of you said that you don't even use social media. Some of you said that you are actually getting a lot of information that you learn from. That is very telling of the richness of African culture broadly. And then a lot of folks also said they're still kind of somewhere in between, where they still see a lot of the very simplistic and marginalizing images that we've seen in the past. So that's a little bit of where I wanted to start and why I wanted to start with with domination. Any other thoughts or questions about that piece or this conversation? Yes, Alex.
If I can, I I had I was going through the comments, and I have a little bit of a confusion, challenge when it comes to the way how the domination was presented on that. I was thinking quite a bit about that. Like, for example, I'm an immigrant here, so I come from Europe about 12 years ago. So, and I see things a little different how I grew up, and I didn't go to high school or school here in the United States, so I didn't start Africa at the age of slavery, but with Egypt, of course. And I think I don't see in that way. However, the domination thing is kind of, I'm challenged a little bit, because when you say, for example, that because of the power of domination, today here I am not being able to like reconnect with the old African roots. So is that because, I ask myself, is that because of a domination, or is it because it's just different? It's different time, different place?
No, it's domination. And we're going to learn about it starting really next week. And I see where your question is coming from, because you're thinking about the passage of time and evolution, right? And different time periods, right?
Not in that sense. I'm just seeing within myself, for example, when I went back home, or like when I moved here and I met other Albanians that came in New York, and I see now new Albanians then immigrating, that they're coming like 12 years after me. And when I came here, I saw people that were here 12 years before me. And the way how they see Albania, it's like with that, for example, when I came here in 2008, people who had come here in like 1999, they were telling me how Albania is. I was like, you cannot tell, I just came from there. Things are not anywhere close to what you think. So that you remain in that culture, but you're not, you don't.
So to your question, it's a little hard to answer because we're talking about very different scenarios. But why I wanted to start with domination is because we are specifically going to think about the ways in which there was an attempt to destroy African culture, specifically the people who will be enslaved. Right? They will be told that they're not allowed to worship in the way that they had worshiped before. They are not going to be able to continue their traditions. They're not going to be able to raise their children in the ways that they had previously raised their children. They're literally going to be taught that everything previous to them was, what is the word that's I don't know the word, savage, right? That savages needed to be enslaved, right? This is what the narrative is. And so, yes, when we're thinking about the ways in which people and culture adapt and evolve over time, and there's going to be change and evolution, that happens with everyone. And we even saw that if we think about the little pieces that we saw from the module and thinking about African culture or African development in terms of humanity, right? But specifically when we think about those people who are going to be enslaved by Europeans, specifically the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Portuguese, but it will expand beyond that and especially involve the English. They're going to be enslaved. They're going to be removed from their homeland. Right? They're not going to have any connection after that to the continent. And then they're going to be taught that everything African and everything Black is less than, because the laws that we're going to learn about that get instituted to define race and enslavement define Black people as chattel, define them as less than human. And so it's different. It's literally a different scenario when we're talking about the people of African descent who end up in the Americas. And the way domination works, there's a specific attempt to erase African memory. And there are people of African descent who don't necessarily know their connection because over time, they haven't been taught the connections to their history of enslavement, and then of course the history of that came before enslavement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. My only concern was like in general in Africa without the enslavement, like.
But see, we can't talk about Africa if we don't talk about enslavement, because we're talking about 300 years. 300 years where millions of people were taken from the continent.
No, I understand. We're a small country. We're about 3 million. However, we're under Ottoman Empire dominance for 500 years. And that not necessarily they did any, even though we're like, there was no race difference.
Because y'all didn't look different, right? Europeans look different from Africans.
They still.
And then what happened? Europeans said, you look different. We can identify you as different. Even though 200 years ago we were trading partners, now we're identifying you as less than. It takes some time. And we're going to talk about that, how that develops over time. But that is literally what we talk about when we're talking about the construction of race. Race is a social construction. That's how you have people who are trading at one point in time, and then all of a sudden those roles have shifted. And that's the piece where when we're talking about Africans, race is important. It's not just, okay, enslavement ended, because the whole system of enslavement was based on this construction of race. It wasn't just based on servitude. Servitude existed in Africa. That's what part of the module was getting you into, right? The trans-Saharan trade involved servitude. It wasn't the primary piece. Gold was what people were really into. But this piece about race is very specific, and it is very complicated, and we're going to get into it, right? Because you're going to see literally the ways in which Europeans start defining not just Africans, those who are going to be native to the Americas, Native Americans, right? Also going to be defined in similar ways, also going to be enslaved because they were different, because they looked different and they worshiped different. They had different spiritual beliefs. So that's the piece. That's the piece that is kind of hard to wrap our brain around.
I totally understand that part, and I took the 140B, and I know all the Jim Crow and everything that happened, and all the segregation laws and everything. I learned.
But we haven't learned what happened with enslavement yet, is what I'm saying, and that's what we're gonna get into. It's literally like this 300-year unfolding of the period of enslavement, which we're moving into. It's going to begin with European exploration, right? It doesn't begin with let's enslave Africans. It began with let's find spices. It did. Mm-hmm. And we'll get into that. And so I would say continue to hold that question, and then let's see if in a couple weeks we can come back to it and reinterrogate it and see if we can flesh it out more and see if there's even more confusion or if perhaps there's more understanding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. But like, for example, we were 500 under the Ottomans, and what they did, especially at the beginning, during the 400, 500, 1500 years, what Ottomans did, they went village per village and recruited boys 7 to 12 years old from each family. Like, they just grabbed their sons and they just send them to a army, and they some did well, some didn't, and they send them to fight in different wars. Now I understand.
And what you're talking about, Alex, is a little bit closer to what we saw in the ancient period in Africa before the periods that we're going to move into, right? Oh. So what you're talking about, enslavement, oppression, hierarchy, servitude, getting people from who can be dominated and using them to build one's army or to be able to build one's military force, right? That is happening in Africa, right? But what's going to be different is what we're going to explore in this class. And that's why I say, hold your question and see if in a week from now, you still have some of the same questions. Because what you're describing is what I'm saying is similar to when we take race out of the equation. But, exactly. But the difference, but that's not what, that doesn't happen when we talk about Africans. Because what happens is race gets constructed. And then that becomes a very different story. And here's also the piece. We have to be willing to study Africans through their own story. And we have to be willing to understand their story is not the same as what necessarily transpired for ancient Africans or even for Europeans, right? And what I'm saying is it is different from what you're describing to what we're going to unpack in the next week or so when we talk about what happens when Africans are forcibly removed from the continent and taken to a whole new place and a whole new system and a whole new country and countries and empires are developing out of this, right? And we're not there yet, but we'll get there. And I think that part of what your question is what's the difference? And that's the whole point. There's a difference, and we're going to get into it. Yeah. All right. So we've gone a little bit longer than I wanted to. Janet, I see a hand. Go ahead.
I might have misunderstood, but I think you made a comment about how we move into this new period of domination. Did I understand you correctly, or should we forget?
Well, I'm saying so this week we're talking about ancient Africa, right? Next week we're going to start talking about European exploration and the beginning of enslavement. And I want you guys to understand that there's long periods of time that we're talking about separating here, right? And so starting with ancient Africa, recognizing the people that were there to begin with, right? Recognizing the cultures that existed before people are going to have to reimagine themselves in a new place, is our starting ground. But we're really moving into understanding Africans in America when we start talking about the enslavement period. And that's the period that we move into. And that's when we really start understanding domination, right? And so the part of introducing you all to the dynamics of domination is also to think about, like, why don't we even know a lot of this earlier stuff? Why do we not tend to start here, right? We're starting here because we want to give value to Africans and not just give value to the systems that were used to oppress Africans or the people who oppressed Africans, right? So that's what I mean. I keep saying we're moving into, it was more so saying we're going to get into that. We're not there yet. But that's what next week is moving into. Chapter 2 of your textbook gets into European exploration. It gets into the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade and the beginnings of enslavement. We still aren't going to make it to the colonial period yet, because we're still talking about when all of this is happening throughout the Atlantic, if that makes sense. So I see I've just got a little bit more time. And so I'm gonna see, okay, I can do this. We can go, I can get through this. We'll see how much I can get through. I'm gonna share my screen again. I just have a few points. Oh geez, there's too much going on my screen. There we go, okay. So we're here. Okay, so I do wanna move us really quickly, just to make sure that we get on track for our next module. Janet, I see a hand. Is that a new hand or an old hand? Okay, an old hand, no problem. So you all have this information in terms of West African societies, and we're thinking moving into the pre-colonial. When I say pre-colonial, that means I'm thinking before the colonial period that we're going to talk about in terms of colonial US, but also prior to the colonization of Africa, which doesn't really happen until the 19th century. But thinking about West Africa, even though we talked a little bit about East and North Africa's significance, West Africa is really significant if we're thinking about the region, the area where the majority of those who will be enslaved in the Americas and throughout the Caribbean islands are coming from, right? And so if we think about that large geographic or climatic map, the savanna and the forest regions are our main interest. And it is significant to think about the fact that these were early farmers. They also domesticated animals, and that the economies revolve largely around agriculture. And that's important if we think about skill sets. That's important if we think about what will be the primary role if we think about the center of the economy of enslaved people, and that is to be agricultural workers. And so we're going to think a little bit about some of those skill sets that Africans brought with them that are exploited in the Americas and the Caribbeans throughout the next couple of weeks. And then of course, what you got to move through in the module was thinking about some of those West African empires, the ways in which they were thriving during the 5th through 15th centuries, with specifically looking at Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And so again, that information is there for you in the modules. Do be sure to go through it, and thinking about our early empires. There was also, of course, the piece about where the wealth of these empires was coming from, and thinking about the trade that West Africans were involved with. And trade was a big piece of West African economy. They traded domestically in terms of throughout West Africa with each other, and then of course they traded internationally across the Sahara. If we think about with Europe, with Middle East, with North Africa, West Africans were international in the ways in which they were trading, and largely that was due to, of course, the camel, and you got to see some pieces in the module about that, and specifically thinking about not just the trade, but the ways in which culture is expanding through trade. Religion and language is also a big piece of what is being shared through trade, which is why if we think about the spread of Islam, that West Africans were really significant in terms of the spread of Islam. And then also if we think about the language of trade and how it is that people are able to come from different parts and trade together, how language starts to be shared and spread. And so Arabic actually becomes the major trade language, language of trade. And again, that's also how it is that our traders become often the first, if we're thinking about the introductions to Islam and conversions. And then of course there was the intellectual spreading as well, oftentimes revolving around religion. But we saw, for example, with Timbuktu, there were, and that was not the only intellectual center, there were actually several intellectual centers. Jenne was another, which I didn't give you a clip on, throughout Africa. Last thing I want to talk about just really quickly, and you of course had this piece, I mentioned this a little bit, is thinking about the diversity. And so I want to just really quickly mention some characteristics that we can think of, or some generalizations that we can think of when it comes to West African culture, but be very clear that this is really just to kind of get an understanding of what was happening and how the people were living, those who would be the ancestors, and of course those who would also be forcibly taken to the Americas and the Caribbean islands. And so just a real quick thinking of the systems of governance, the economic systems, and the social organization and religion or spirituality, which I gave you a little bit within the module. And I know some of you might be writing this down, so I will pause for a second if anybody is working on getting that into their notes. And you'll notice that sometimes I will interchangeably say religion and spirituality. It's really more appropriately for me to say spirituality. Your textbook uses religion, more so thinking about organized religion. But you'll see me go back and forth between religion and spirituality when talking about the African context, so don't be confused by that. Is anybody still working on this? All right. So, oops. So the first thing that I want to just touch on, and this is the systems of governance, and I will say divine kingship is for lack of a better term, and that I put it in quotes because I'm saying that that's my term, but thinking about hereditary family rule that is also connected to a spiritual or religious belief system. And so the systems of governance that we see kind of generally throughout the pre-colonial time is one where there is family rule. We're thinking of our families broadly, extended families, not the kind of Western nuclear limited family, but your role in society was decided by your family, and those who were the ruling class were divinely appointed. And so usually an understanding in the belief system that the family that was sat at the top was somehow connected to the spiritual beliefs. There were usually dynasties where you could have family rule, but a break in a dynasty would mean a new family rule. And we saw that, for example, with the coming of the Songhai people and some of the tensions within that empire. And then we also know that it can be either matrilineal or patrilineal. And this is thinking about the line of descent either being along the mother's line of descent or in terms of how one associates or the father's line of descent. And to be clear, you could be matrilineal where your descendants is dictated by the mother's line of descent, but it could still be ruled by men, where that would be patriarchal, right? You could have a matrilineal society that was still patriarchal. You could have a matrilineal society that was matriarchal. And so those things were not always a given, depending on the group, ethnic group we're talking about. The empires, of course, are growing when one kingdom conquers another. You can have more than one ethnic group within a given empire. And to be clear, I use the term ethnic groups. I don't use the term tribe. I like to acknowledge the ethnic groups. I find tribe is usually has been a word that has been imposed on Africans, even though many Africans in our modern world use that term. I prefer ethnic group. And your textbook talks about stateless societies, but really what is meant by that is self-governing. And so we have our empires where there's clear rule. Sometimes there's clear hierarchy. Sometimes there's just a form of tax or tribute that was expected. The stateless societies were self-governing. An example of that would be the Igbo. If any of you who are familiar with Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart, he's documenting the experiences of the Igbo who come from modern day Nigeria. And to be clear, when we're thinking about the period of enslavement that we're moving into, those who were self-governing were going to be the most vulnerable to enslavement. Those who had the protection of a kingdom or empire were going to be the most protected, at least initially, although it gets very complicated in this 3-century explosion of enslavement that happens over time. In terms of economic systems, of course, agriculture is dominant, mostly farmers. That's going to be important when we think about what people are coming to the United States or the Americas with. We don't even get to the United States so much later. Another piece that's really significant here is this idea of property ownership or ownership of land. There wasn't a concept of private property in the same way that we will see Europeans hold. And so that's going to be significant if we think about the way Africans are developing and also a distinction between what's going to happen in terms of what develops in the Americas. This concept of ownership of land has everything to do with their spiritual beliefs. It had and connections to the land being part of a larger belief system, or a belief that there is a creator God that created all things, including the land. And so people could not own land. They could own the fruits of their labor, that they may have worked on the land, but not the land itself. And so that's a big distinction. And we see even in terms of the relationship between early enslaved Africans in the Americas, these concepts of land are extended into how they are forming ideas of community. And then of course trade is going to be at the center. The last thing that I wanted to mention, or two more things. The social organization, of course, you've got some of these pieces already in the module. Family is the most important institution. Determines your profession, determines your rank in society, and this will be core. Family is going to be important in terms of ideas of kinship as we move forward. And we start thinking about the ways in which family remains important for Africans, even when we move into the period of enslavement, but how kinship has to start being, how notions and ideas of family and kinship start extending even beyond bloodlines. And we'll start thinking about that as early as thinking about the relationships that start being formed through the Middle Passage. As people start thinking of those who they were captive with as being part of their family. Gender, class, and age are all also significant if we think about West African organization. Certain roles for women and men with balance often emphasized, including spirituality, usually thinking about the spiritual roles of the divinities or the deities. Gender roles were often included. And then class and age are an important piece as well. Different expectations depending on which class or which ruling or which family you belong to, and then different expectations for age groups that sometimes corresponded with gender. And we'll see again some of these pieces of social organization being extended into what we'll see developing in the Americas as African Americans start developing and forming a new culture or cultures, so to speak. And then the last piece, which I don't have time for, and I'll either do something in your next module or we'll begin with it next time. We'll probably begin with it next time in your module, is thinking about religion or spirituality. And I'll show you the slide that I have for that, even though we don't have time to go into it. And thinking about traditional religious beliefs. And we'll talk a little bit about this next time in either our module or our Zoom class. But for thinking about the belief systems that Africans throughout West Africa especially had, here are some generalizations around those. And so depending on the group, there of course were different names and creation stories and divinities, but a creator God that is the God of all things is a big piece of traditional religious beliefs throughout Africa and West Africa in particular. The lesser gods, however, are what people are more familiar with. The idea of the divinities or the deities that are attached to nature. Oftentimes, these are the gods that, or spiritual beings that Africans interacted with on a daily basis. They were more like intermediaries between the creator God and the people themselves. We'll get into these other pieces, the veneration of special ancestors, this idea that nature is animated by God, dualism of the gods, meaning often they came in pairs. And then of course, these ideas of communal morality and immortality that will be important pieces of the African experience, even beyond the continent. We'll pick up on those next time. So I'm gonna stop there. I'm a minute over my time. I'm gonna stop my share and see if there's any questions.
Yes, I had 2 questions.
Yes.
And this was like leading back to what you were talking about with like hereditary lineages and stuff like that. But
Mhm.
you know how they say that people aren't born racist? Do you believe that there's some sort of bearing that certain lineages have to some sort of innate prejudice?
I'm gonna go ahead and say no. That's a really complicated question, but I'm gonna go ahead and say no. I think that this stuff is taught, and I think that it gets reinforced by incentives, motives, and then we start tying these ideas into culture and belief systems that people start thinking of as being fact and being biological and being innate, right? But that's again why I wanted to start with saying at one point in time, we're going to think of people who were once trading partners who are then now debasing those people centuries later. So that's my take on it. It's a much more complicated question if you want to think about the history of people who have dominated. I don't really study the history of people who have done a lot of the domination. I study the history of people who have usually been marginalized and dominated, specifically Africans. And so that's my take on that.
And so the second question is, how long has this been occurring from the point in which there could be a possibility of some sort of innate prejudice? Like how long is the time frame? 500 years?
So the part of the so I don't so we're gonna pick up next week. I'll say is we're gonna pick up already in the 1400s common era, right? So numbers are moving up. And so because I'm not an expert in ancient history, I can't take you much further back, but I will say that what we'll look at specifically is we will really think about the 300 to 400 year period that the period of enslavement developed next week. And so we're thinking 300 to 400 years of really this really being cemented into a system where people were defined as less than human by the end of it, and that became what people understood as truth when it, of course, was not truth. So for some of these like longer time frame questions, let's come back to those next time. I don't want to hold us over too much, but yeah, we're going to talk about 300-400 years worth of enslavement developing over time in our next class, in our next module.
Thanks
So with that, I'm going to end our recording here. I'll stick around if anyone has any